Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome this morning at the Diplomatic Academy, and please welcome especially our guest of honor, Lord Robertson. Please welcome also the real host of this morning, Ambassador Aleksander Geržina. Please accept that you are all special guests. I don't welcome any one of you especially, but our moderator, because Mr. Ultsch will moderate this morning. Welcome, Christian Ultsch.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is it's not a NATO event, but it's an event about the NATO. Some people would say maybe in Austria we would need NATO events and not events about NATO. But this sort of discussion we had in this country quite a long time ago. I'm very happy that we can discuss here this morning because at 75 years, obviously NATO is not what one European president said 5 years ago, 4.5 years ago, about the situation of NATO, but it is a necessary security provider. That's how I see it from my point of view, and I think this should be part of the discussion. What we discuss here at the Academy is very often, is NATO the only credible and the most successful security provider, as Lord Robertson once said in an interview, or is it more? Does it really do a global job? Does this really have changed? Some analysts say yes, others say no, actually it's still a defense provider and a security provider. So I think this is one of the important issues that we have at 75 years. I'm not going into the Austrian discussion about our relationship. Just let me say, we have been working with NATO for such a long time. We joined the Partnership for Peace program already in '95, the year when we joined also the Union. So that makes almost 30 years of cooperation with NATO, with ups and downs, but these are all issues that are not to be discussed at this place, at this very moment, because this is a place where I got a phone call months ago from Aleksander, from Ambassador Geržina, saying, actually, the Slovene embassy in Austria is the Austrian contact point of NATO. So let us do something to explain what the situation of NATO is and who could be the best person to explain this. And you proposed that Lord Robertson will talk here. I'm happy that we managed to do this. Welcome from my side. And I ask the Slovene ambassador now to explain why he thought it's a good moment and a good place to discuss this. Good morning.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Dear Lord Robertson, dear George, Ambassador Brix. Actually, George said yesterday that he would never thought he would celebrate 75 years of NATO in Vienna, but things happen. So, let me tell you that we are extremely happy that you are here with us, Lord Robertson. As Ambassador Brix said, Slovenian embassy for the 4th year is having a role as a NATO contact point embassy in Austria, which is not the easiest task, but we are managing somehow. And of course, because we have a number of anniversaries this year, 75 years since North Atlantic Treaty was signed, 20 years of the biggest enlargement from 2004, we thought it might be interesting to commemorate these important events which changed, of course, our continent substantially. But Lord Robertson is above all, first and foremost, an old friend of Slovenia. This goes back to the very beginnings of Slovenia independence, where Slovenia was looking for friends and allies. And at that time, this is the period of beginning of '90s. Lord Robertson was a Labour MP from Scotland, quite a prominent one. Then later, of course, Lord Robertson became Defense Secretary under the Blair government in 1997, and then 2 years later, NATO Secretary General. In his time, quite some important issues happened, some achievements, some decisions. Under Lord Robertson, NATO, for the first time in its history, invoked Article 5 after the terrorist attacks in the United States on the 11th of September, and 1 year later, it was at the Prague summit under Lord Robertson's leadership also, where 7 countries, among others also Slovenia, were invited to start accession talks with NATO. So Lord Robertson, in my view and in our view, has a very prominent role, and he's simply an honest and true friend, and then Secretary General of NATO. And this is a very, very rare species nowadays, to have true and honest friends. Of course, world and Europe changed dramatically since those years, 90s, and a lot happened since then. We have wars on the European continent, and we will not find today necessarily all the answers, but I'm sure the discussion with Lord Robertson will be extremely interesting for all of us, and might lead us to better understand what happened and how our own conclusions can be for the months or years ahead. But since today we are commemorating 70, and this is the main reason, as Ambassador Brix said, 75 years since the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty, it would be perhaps good to remind ourselves why NATO was created. And here I cannot but quote the former US Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, who was actually a founding father of NATO. And I quote, this is what he said at the signing ceremony of the treaty on the 4th of April 1949 in Washington. He said, quote, "The reality," and this is very important, "the reality lies not in the common pursuit of a material goal or in the power to dominate others. It lies in the affirmation of moral and spiritual values which govern the kind of life they propose to lead and which they propose to defend by all possible means, should that necessity be thrust upon them," unquote. Lord Robertson, dear George, we are very happy to have you with us, and I wish all of you a very interesting morning. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I hope it is switched on. It is. Well, thank you, Ambassador Geržina. Thank you, Ambassador Brix, for setting this up. I had the privilege to attend a dinner yesterday with Lord Robertson. I can assure you this will be very interesting and entertaining and witty 90 minutes for you. And if you don't mind, Lord, at least in the first question, I would like to cling to the topic. 75 years of NATO. NATO is a child of the Cold War. Times have changed. There is this famous saying by the first Secretary General, it has been repeated all over again, that NATO was founded to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Yeah, well, some things have changed. Maybe nobody wants to keep the Germans down anymore. But not only this has changed, a lot has changed. And I want to know from you, first, in which shape do you think is NATO right now?
I think it's in pretty good shape. I used to sort of recharacterize what Lord Ismay said as being, my modern version was, keeping the Americans in, get the Russians closer, and get the Germans to spend more money on defense.
Well,
that was the contemporary version.
Somehow didn't work out, right?
not all the time. But you know, the alliance is in good form. I supervised over an alliance of 19 nations, was 11 in the beginning, and it's now 32. I spent 4 years in NATO trying to get Sweden and Finland to apply for membership of NATO, and Vladimir Putin managed it in 4 weeks. So we've now got the two non-aligned, neutral countries recognizing that being in a collective security organization was the one single way in which their people can be properly protected at the moment. So although NATO has, over the years, adapted to the world and to the way in which the world has developed, it went from a Cold War warrior to being a consolidator of the post-Soviet space into the transformation that was brought about by 9/11, and now in the increasingly difficult world initiated by the invasion of Ukraine. At each of these junctures, NATO has adapted and has changed, and is still as relevant today as it was at the beginning.
Well, I remember there was a time when NATO looked for a new purpose after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then it decided to enter into out-of-area missions, Afghanistan, for instance. Do you think that in this time somehow NATO had lost its purpose and that it has found it again now?
There's a lot of people who say NATO made choices, either the right choices or the right choices. Actually, circumstance has made NATO the relevant organization that it is. So the Cold War was a period of time when collective security meant that the Soviet Union had to be stopped in its tracks. The dominoes were falling right across Europe, and the Americans decided that with the Europeans, there had to be an organization that would stop that onward march of Stalin. And that went right on until 1989, when, at a NATO meeting, the ambassador of the Soviet Union left for lunch and came back in the afternoon to say that his country no longer existed. Now, at that point, you could have said the choice might have been to say, right, let's wind up.
Yeah.
We've fulfilled our function. But the choice wasn't there because the countries of the Warsaw Pact could see that there was a vacuum that had been created. And only NATO was the organization that they saw able to take them from transition, from communism to capitalism, from command economies to mixed economies, from military control of the military to civilian control of the military. And therefore, NATO had a role there. So the North Atlantic Consultative Council was created. The Partnership for Peace was created. So the out-of-area role, the military role, was not until 1995 when the explosion of violence in Bosnia created a situation where effectively the only organization that was going to be able to deal with the violence that was there and the way in which it was spreading. The people in Austria will remember at that time, the outflowing of people from the Balkans at that stage. I remember before I went to NATO, the Swiss ambassador to London saying to me, he said, "Thank goodness you're going," he said, "because you've got to do something about the Balkans, because 40% of our prison population is made up of people who have spilled over from that area." So there was a common concern at that time. It wasn't a matter of NATO saying, "Here's a problem, we'll go and fix it." It was collectively people saying, something has to be done, and here we have an organization capable and able to do it. So, so in each of these things, like Afghanistan wasn't a choice. There was no other alternative to NATO.
Isn't there always a choice? Well,
the choice is to do nothing. If you take well, you could take Kosovo, for example. Who was going to be able to coordinate the military activity that would have stopped the Milosevic genocidal attacks on the Kosovo Albanians? You know, there was no other organization. The OSCE couldn't do it. The European Union couldn't do it. NATO was the only organization able and capable of doing it. The same in Bosnia, and the same in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we had two coalitions of the willing ran ISAF in the initial stages. After the Taliban had been defeated, the British ran a headquarters, and I think Turkey ran a headquarters. And it became obvious internationally that we weren't going to find another nation that was going to be able to host the kind of complicated headquarters that would be required to run that. And only NATO was able to do it. And I had to go and persuade, you know, President Chirac. I had to go to the White House to persuade President Bush, you know, that NATO was the only organization able and capable of doing it. Yeah. Well, the British were resistant because they'd done it already. The French were resistant because they weren't really in favor of NATO flags in Afghanistan. And America, under Donald Rumsfeld, didn't want to get involved. They said, we did the fighting, you can do the mopping up. Oh, yeah. Something I disabused them of very quickly. But the president made the decision that it should be NATO. So in each of these cases, the choice was NATO or a worse alternative.
Well, you were Secretary General when the decision was made to go to Afghanistan, so I can imagine it must have been very painful to see how this mission turned out in the end. Some even draw a direct line from the 15th of August when Kabul fell to the 24th of February to the Russian invasion, because it was a sign, it was maybe perceived as a sign of weakness of the West. So what is your take on that?
No, that's very true, and I felt very, very, personally very bitter about the way in which the shambolic withdrawal took place. But actually the line goes back further than that. It goes back to the 13th of August 2013 when the British House of Commons made a decision not to accept the recommendation of Prime Minister Cameron to launch military action against Syria, who crossed a red line. Remember the red line that Obama laid down about the use of chemical weapons, to which Britain had been a subscriber. David Cameron put the matter to the British House of Commons, and they voted him down. And remarkably, he still stayed on after that. I found that puzzling in the extreme when a Prime Minister... But that was the moment when Putin, first of all, got engaged in the Middle East. You know, remember, they were bit players before that. But it gave him an entree to go into Syria at that time. And it was a signal of the weakness of the West. Both Cameron and then Obama were not going to deliver on the red lines that they had laid down about the conduct of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So that you can directly sort of take it from these events right through to the shambolic exit from Afghanistan. And that encouraged Putin to believe, wrongly as it turned out, that we were weak, we were divided, and that he could take reckless adventures and get away with it in a way that it is now proved he can't do.
Well, I find it interesting that you served as a Secretary General of NATO in a, if you look back at it, in a pivotal moment of history. Back then, between 1999 and 2003, everybody was talking about the unipolar moment of the US, so there was a clear dominance of Western countries. In the end, this moment was squandered in a way. So looking back, do you sometimes think that some things could have been done differently?
Well, I think now, in retrospect, we were too complacent. We sort of assumed the end of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Union, was a moment where Western liberal values that we have grown used to were now the norm. That we could take the peace dividend. We were cutting defense budgets, up from 1990 to 1997, the Americans cut their defense budget by 30%, and so did the rest of us. Because we all believe, that there was a different world. Yeltsin was in charge in Russia. Might have looked shambolic, but it was better than the Soviet Union. And maybe we let our guard down. Maybe we believed that this was something that was permanent, when we should have recognized that there were underlying trends that would have convinced us otherwise. But the 11th of September, 2001 changed all of that. The unipolar world, the American domination suddenly was seen to be vulnerable. All of us will remember that day vividly. It's imprinted on our minds. And I was just a spectator, in NATO headquarters in my office, watching these television screens and the Twin Towers coming down, and a sort of dawning realization that actually we were players, that I was involved in this, that I was standing in a military headquarters underneath the flight path to Brussels airport, as it happened as well, but that we were involved and we were engaged in that more than just spectators.
Article 5 was activated.
Yeah, but even that wasn't, it was seen as pretty unprecedented. It struck me at the time, America has been attacked, and that is what Article 5 is about. An attack on one country is an attack on all. In the initial stages, we didn't know if it was a domestic terrorist event. After all, the Oklahoma bombing had taken place not long before that. And nobody at that point actually knew whether it was or not. But if it was an external enemy, then it seemed to me that would then Article 5 would apply. And some of my people started to draft statements. I phoned Colin Powell. I said, "What about Article 5?" And he said, "I know about Article 5, but why are you mentioning it?" I said, "Well, you've been attacked." And, "Oh, yeah, so we have." So a dawning awareness that there was suddenly a relevance to that. But it wasn't just figurative. It wasn't just symbolic. A country had been attacked. It happened to be the biggest country in the alliance. It happened to be the most powerful country in the alliance. It might have been just a terrorist incident and not the Soviet the Soviet tanks coming across the North German plain, but the country had been attacked. So what is interesting in a way about it, because which is relevant to today, is that having made the decision we would go for Article 5 and getting the agreement of the American ambassador, who's now the ambassador to China, and Condoleezza Rice and others, it had to go to the North Atlantic Council. And that wasn't a given. Because I put it to the North Atlantic Council at, I think, 3:30 in the afternoon, and I said, "You've got to be back here at 7 o'clock with your country's answers to that." And then I manned the phones, talking to, there was one prime minister who was in a memorial service, couldn't be dragged out. There was a chairman of a defence committee who wasn't in favour. There was somebody who said, "Delay it," whatever. So I had to use a lot of my political skills, the dark arts sometimes, to get it. And by, I think it was 8:30 at night, when all the European newspapers had gone to bed, but it was alive in America, we got it. In the morning, everybody thought it was their idea. So I was vindicated.
I remember that back then, Putin was already president, and he was supportive. Also in Afghanistan, and you said it recently also in interviews, but it's very interesting. What kind of What kind of Putin did you meet back then? And how has he changed, probably?
Well, he's changed completely. But the Putin who was first on the phone to President Bush to express sympathy with the terrorist attacks was also the Putin that we did good business with, who I met on something like 9 occasions, where we created the NATO-Russia Council, where the atmosphere was good and cordial. It's not the Putin of today. I've got the transcript of the press conference that was given after the NATO-Russia summit in 2002, the 28th of May 2002. And in answer to a question, the president of Russia said this: Ukraine is an independent sovereign state, and it will choose its own path to peace and security. These are his words at that time. And he now says Ukraine is not a country, has no right to exist, and it will be by force subsumed into the Russian Federation. So there has been a complete transformation.
What do you think has made change his mind?
Well, a whole series of things. In his own mind, a delusion that there is a greater Russia, that only the recreation of the Soviet Union in international terms, with the same respect that was given to the Soviet Union, the same admiration in many ways, the same fear that was engendered by the Soviet Union was the equality that he was increasingly wanting. And so it wasn't the equality around the north, around the NATO-Russia Council table that he sat that afternoon with. It was an equality with the United States of America. And I think gradually, as he became more isolated, more powerful, more paranoid, that began to develop. And if you consider what happened in Georgia, first of all, then the invasion of the Donbass and Crimea, all of this sort of building up in his mind, along with these thoughts that the West was weak, indecisive, split, and not being sufficiently admiring of Russia and Russia's strength. When President Obama, in an offhand remark, said Russia is just another regional power, to the Putin that I met, that would cut to the quick. Everyone imagines that politicians are very thick-skinned, and we've got some of them in the audience here as well, but we're actually not. We're very sensitive creatures.
But isn't that childish in a way? I mean, it's one remark.
It is. But that's the nature of the thin skin of the man that I saw. Even in the good days, even in these days when we were friends and we were cooperating, across the table, that famous white table that Macron sat at the end of, sitting in the middle of that, if I mentioned, as I had to, Georgia or Chechnya or Latvia, Putin stopped being the cool, calm, sober, serious ex-KGB guy on the other side of the table and became animated. Now, it was a controlled animation, but it was a change of mood, almost a change of character. On one occasion, he picked up his pad from the table and he started drawing a map of Georgia with villages, named villages in the Pankisi Gorge, which was a famous part of Georgia, and sort of saying with emotion, how is it these people can spot a Russian jet at 20,000 feet, but they can't see a bunch of bandits coming through their village in the middle of the night? And you thought, wait a minute, But there was a passion that was there, and I think that sort of approach to things was building up in his mind with this ludicrous version of history that sort of said, because Prince Yaroslav the Wise had created the modern Russian state in Kiev. Therefore, he wanted to recreate it again. So don't underestimate how thin-skinned your politicians can be and how they can sometimes overreact as a consequence of it.
You've lately recounted that Putin even asked you when you will forward an invitation to NATO. I mean, was this some sort of a joke, or how do you interpret that in hindsight?
Well, he had a sense of humor. He seems to have lost it recently. And I'm one of the few people probably still alive who can actually tell humorous stories about Vladimir Putin. But I don't think he was joking that day. This was the second meeting I had. And he said, when are you going to invite Russia to join NATO? And I said, well, we don't invite countries to join NATO, like Slovenia. You know, you have to apply for membership. And he instantly said, well, Russia's not going to stand in line with a lot of countries that don't matter. And I said, well, can we just stop the diplomatic sword dance and establish a relationship and see where it takes us? And that was the end of it. Now, you know, there's an old principle in politics. You don't ask a question unless you already know the answer. So he knew what the answer was going to be. But it was a gambit, you know, to sort of throw it into the mix of the discussion that was there. And, you know, the chemistry on the day of the NATO-Russia summit, and that's, you know, the later on, was really good. You know, I think I was telling you last night about Putin cracking a joke at the end of that summit meeting.
Yeah, you have to tell it.
You know, sort of a play on words, who's saying, I was the chairman of the North Atlantic Council, the chairman of the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, and now the chairman of the NATO-Russia Council. So perhaps the NATO headquarters should be called the House of Councils. And for those who know the Russian language, the Russian word for councils is Soviets. So the interpreter said, I'd propose you call the NATO headquarters the House of Soviets, which didn't go down terribly well with the Polish delegation who were sitting opposite me. As well, but you know, so he was. You know, the chemistry that day was very different to what has developed subsequently.
Could a better, different relationship been established between Russia and NATO? So was there an opportunity to create something, maybe something new?
There might have been, but I don't think, you know, that the Vladimir Putin who was developing was going to be interested in it. At the beginning, the NATO-Russia Council spawned a whole series of working groups, subjects as varied as, you know, sort of search and rescue at sea, the disposal of redundant ammunition, defense medicine, joint activity in terms of terrorism, even defense reform was on the agenda for these working parties. Now, you know, as ministers who are here in the audience know, you know, one of the secrets of the European Union, never mind of NATO, but the European Union is this network, a spider's web of committees that envelop you all the time. You know, at every level in a country, you're involved in some organism that is involved in the European Union, so that you can't really go to war over Alsace-Lorraine or the Rhineland because you're too busy arguing about the price of corn or a wine lake or something else. So that spider's web holds the union together. And NATO had, when I arrived, 600 committees. So again,
Soviet
you know,
style.
Yeah, almost. But they spawned a lot of amazing things. The invention of the antiretroviral cure for HIV/AIDS came out of a NATO science committee. That's another story. And a book written by the Belgian ambassador to the Czech Republic explains in detail how that happened. So these committees are all there, and I think we might have attracted Russia into that. We had two very big conferences on the military side, the military aspects of counterterrorism. One of them at the NATO Defense College in Rome, and the other one in the Ministry of Defense in Moscow. And they were hugely successful with people out of uniform talking about common problems, common difficulties, and common solutions. So we might have developed something out of that. But I think, you know, some of the people in the American administration didn't want to get too close to Russia. And by that time, anyway, Putin was developing this idea that he wanted much more respect and admiration and much more equality than he was getting. And I think that was the biggest factor in stopping that development.
One last historical question, but it leads us to present times. There is this Russian narrative that NATO and the West broke a promise, and that NATO enlargement is threatening Russia. That's why Russia has to act the way it acts now. You said you've met Putin 9 times. Can you remember that he brought this issue up back then?
No, not once. Never mentioned NATO enlargement once. And actually, I think from his point of view and from Yeltsin's point of view, NATO enlargement produced for the Russians something they've never had in their history before, and that was a stable Western frontier. And I think even the most ideological of them would recognize that that was a major advantage for Russia. But he never mentioned NATO enlargement at all. There was one occasion when we talked about the conventional forces in Europe treaty, a bit of a sort of geeky subject, which the foreign minister here will know all about. And he swatted away the foreign minister who wanted to sort of add something to it. He said, that's enough. So the narrative is a fiction. It's built up in his mind, and it's built up in Russian mythology, and it's wrong. So the narrative is Gorbachev was tricked by George Shultz,
yes,
allegedly in some corridor one day, informally saying NATO will not move 1 inch beyond its present borders. Now, there's nothing written down, nothing said, and anyway, even if it was said, it doesn't bind future generations or future countries as well. And he makes out basically that Yeltsin must have been drunk when he signed the Budapest Memorandum, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, the Vienna document, the Helsinki Final Act, and all of that. But, you know, that's a piece of paper here I've got. This piece of paper are the signatures of the heads of state and government at the NATO-Russia summit in 2002, who signed up to the Rome Declaration, which established a variety of principles, including the territorial integrity of all states. And that is the signature of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin on that, his signature. So it's nothing to do with Yeltsin, nothing to do with Gorbachev, nothing to do with George Shultz. He signed up to the basic principles that were in the Founding Act. I've got a copy of Putin's speech that day at the NATO-Russia summit. But one sentence is quite good. This is why the institutions. Now wait a minute. We should remember that more than half a century ago, humanity paid with tens of millions of lives for the criminal short-sightedness and hesitation of politicians in joining forces against the common enemy. We are now facing a task which is comparable in scale by historical standards. Yes, the current threat is in a new guise and has a different ethos, but it's no less dangerous for the fate of humanity.
It was about terrorism, right, back then? Okay.
Ostensibly about terrorism.
Yes.
But actually, the Rome Declaration was about more than that. I haven't got a copy. I've got a screen grab of it here. When you read it, he's committing himself to the territorial integrity of all states. He's talking about adhering to the UN Charter and to the principles of the Helsinki Final Act at that time. But, you know, that's not what he's saying now. But the narrative is retrospective. I don't believe that he's worried about the NATO aircraft carrier in Ukraine. You know, the idea that NATO has encroached right up against the Russian border. What started all of this in the first place was the European Union's offer of an association agreement to Ukraine in Vilnius in Lithuania, and Yanukovych being told by the Kremlin to reject it. The European Union is a much bigger threat to Vladimir Putin than NATO.
Why?
Because the European Union changes countries totally, completely, and permanently. It changes countries from command economies to mixed economies, from parliamentary, from the rule of the party to rule of the parliament, military control of the military to civilian control of the military. So he could see that in Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, in the former, in Slovenia and the other countries as well. And that really endangered the Putin model of this sort of authoritarian leadership. And I think that's a much bigger threat to Putin and to Russia in his eyes than NATO is. You know, we had an information office in Moscow. You know, Russia's got 7,000 nuclear weapons. Doesn't have to worry about a military alliance. But it really, really has to worry about the transformation of societies, which is what the European Union was about.
What would it mean for the European Union and NATO if Russia wins the war in Ukraine?
I think the stakes are high, you know, hugely important. If he wins, you know, I'm quoted in this week's Economist as saying, you know, if Putin wins, our enemies will write the world rules, and that's a fact of life. If he gets away with the invasion of Ukraine, the elimination of Ukraine as a sovereign, independent nation state, then your borders are not going to be secure in the future. Now, he may not turn his eyes on NATO countries. Behind the Article 5 guarantee, I believe countries are relatively safe.
Also the Baltic states.
Yeah, the Baltic states are very close to Russia, but it would involve, you know, if he goes 1 inch across the borders of Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, he crosses the Article 5 line. You know, I'm the first person in NATO's history to declare Article 5. I firmly believe I will be the last person to invoke Article 5, because nobody is going to cross that line in a military context. But if I lived in Moldova, or I lived in Armenia or Kazakhstan or the Central Asian republics, I would be very worried about his ambition about recreating the Soviet Union. But I also believe that the West is in danger as well. Maybe not from a military attack, but the hybrid warfare that Russia is now almost an expert in is what we should really fear. You know, the grey zone that Russia, of cyber attacks, of attacks on our critical national infrastructure, of disinformation, meddling in elections, targeted assassinations, organized crime, organized corruption. All of these things are the instruments of the grey zone, which are being perfected inside the Russian system. And that's where the real danger to all of us comes. That if he gets away, a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, who has broken all of the agreements, including the United Nations Charter, gets away with changing borders by force, then there isn't a border in the world that is going to be immune to that. And I think, you know, the global South countries really have to waken up to the sort of anarchy that is promised if that principle is actually established.
Well, at the moment they don't care. They just say it's not our problem. Ukraine is far away, right?
Yeah, but there is a principle being involved. You know, I watched on the television the other night the UN Security Council, and the UN Security Council is not just made up of the permanent members. They're the ones, you know, whose speeches were being carried. But Slovenia is a member of the UN Security Council, and so are a whole host of other countries. They adhere, they believe. They're part and parcel of a structure that says the UN Charter matters. And if a permanent member who just happens to have nuclear weapons gets away with it, then you know, what happens? You know, what about Ukraine? Ukraine was a non-aligned country. You could say it was a neutral country, protected by the Budapest Memorandum. In 1994, Ukraine was the third nuclear weapon power in the world. In the aftermath of the Soviet Union, they had intercontinental ballistic missiles. They had the whole range of nuclear weaponry on their soil, and they gave it all up, encouraged by the West to give it all up to the Russian Federation in return for the guarantees established in the Budapest Memorandum, signed by France, Britain, the United States, Russia, and China, guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It even actually went beyond that. It actually talked about non-interference in the domestic affairs and politics of Ukraine. And at the end of the day, absolutely worthless, because we're up against a nuclear power. So that, you know, the lessons that will be derived are very ominous and very serious. And a world where the rules of order are written by Russia and China and North Korea and Iran will not be a comfortable world for us to live in.
If you look at the battlefield in Ukraine now, with your expertise as former defense minister and former Secretary General of NATO, what is your take right now?
Well, the take is that it is not looking good at the moment for the Ukrainians, because they're not making the advances that they'd hoped and that many of us expected last year, because largely the Russians have dug in minefields, trenches, back to the First World War in many ways, concrete establishments to do that. But that also implies that the Russians are not making advances either. He's already lost a lot of the territory that he took in the initial stages of the invasion itself. He has not commanded the territory that the Duma formally annexed. All of that, all of the Donbass has not been taken at all, and they are largely involved now in territorial defensiveness and not in any form of advance. Now, if the $60 billion subvention from the United States is freed up, as we're told it might be this week, that could be quite a game changer in terms of the Ukrainians. You know, the Ukrainians have done remarkably well. Remember, this was to be a 3-day war. 3 days was all it was going to take. The mighty Russian Federation, with all of the troops it had, all of the planes it had, all of the tanks, ammunition that it had, it was going to take 3 days to take over control of Ukraine. And where are they? They're absolutely paralyzed. They've lost pretty well all of their Black Sea fleet, which was very precious to them. And, you know, Sevastopol is the port on the Black Sea that was most prized by Russia when it invaded Crimea in the first place. That fleet has now been decimated by the actions of the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians have actually shown a degree of inventiveness and tenacity and courage and bravery that I think has shocked the Russians and inspired the rest of Europe as a whole. So, you know, this story has not yet been written. It hasn't been finished, and we will know when we know what's going to happen. But I haven't lost hope in the Ukrainians and their ability to get their own country back.
Before I open up the floor, I would have like 3 more questions. One is the Trump question. So what will change for Europe, for Ukraine, for Europe's security policy if Trump will win the elections in the US?
Well, we don't know. We don't know whether he's going to be the candidate. We don't know whether he's going to win the election. The opinion polls in the last few days have shown his lead diminishing substantially, and he seems to be tied up in a court of law at the present moment, which you can't really believe is going to help him enormously. But, Donald Trump has already been president.
Mm.
So, we don't have to speculate completely about what he would do in the future. And during the last presidency, he authorized the Javelin missiles that were given to Poland. He increased American defense expenditure, and he increased the amount of money that America allocates to NATO. He may have thrown question marks over Article 5 in recent times. There's a certain amount of electoral rhetoric coming out about, people paying their way. Well, each of the Baltic countries pays more than the 2%, pays more than the NATO average, and actually has contributed more per head of the population to any of the missions that NATO has been involved in. So if they're the most vulnerable countries, then he's already made commitments to making protection for them as well. But American democracy is American democracy. We have to take whoever the American people elect. And if it causes problems for us in Europe, because the big brother is not paying in the same way as it used to, then the Europeans better do something about it.
Yeah. Are they doing enough?
Well, no, they're not doing nearly enough. Jim Mattis, who was Trump's first defense secretary, once said, "Why should we Americans care more about the safety of Europe's children than the Europeans?" And that sums it up. All of us here, even in so-called non-aligned Austria, we know what the threat is. It's visible, it's there, we've seen it. Day by day by day, we are seeing what the Russians are doing against a sovereign, independent nation state. So we know what the threat is. It's not academic anymore. It's not theoretical. It's not, it might happen. They've done it. And we've seen in Bucha what Russian troops will do if they take over a part of Western or so-called neutral countries in the way of doing it. So we need, in the interests of our own people and the safety of our own people, we need to do much more. And that would give us a degree of equality inside the alliance, which at the moment is unbalanced because we expect America and its nuclear umbrella and its troops and its superior equipment to be there always if we get into trouble.
As we're here in Vienna, last question by me, do you see a room for neutrality in this new world of new power politics? Do you see a sense in it?
There's no such thing as neutrality. You can pretend to be neutral. You can pretend to be non-aligned. I remember in Sweden them telling me why they were non-aligned. Because they didn't want to be part of a military alliance, and we've never been, and the rest of it. And I've heard that argument. I heard that argument in Finland as well. But when suddenly reality is on your doorstep, you realize that collective defense is the best form of defense. So neutrality didn't help the neutral countries before the First World War or before the Second World War. Neutrality didn't protect countries against the migrant flows of 2008 or the overspill from Bosnia and Kosovo and from the Balkans or from the from the outside world. Collective defence and collective expenditure on defence, I think, is a matter of principle if we're going to maintain the standard of life that we have and protect future generations into the future. It is. I don't want to enter into the politics of Austria. Don't even like getting involved in the politics of the United Kingdom at the present moment, which are pretty messy as well. But I can also say, as somebody looking at the world as a whole, nobody is neutral in a world where Vladimir Putin has got aggressive intentions and is displaying.
But don't you need some places for where you can open up communication channels, where you can try to mediate between the blocs? So maybe it's not completely obsolete. At least that's what most of the Austrians and Austrian politicians would say.
Well, yeah, but you can have a venue anywhere. I think that's it's a thin argument in a world where a sovereign nation state has been invaded and brutalized. That's the kind of world we live in. That's the kind of Europe that we inhabit at the present moment. And in these circumstances, it's very difficult to be neutral, between good and evil, between aggression and peacefulness. And I think that's the question that people will have to ask. Austria is a member of the European Union. The European Union imposes a degree of self-protection on its members. If a member is attacked under the articles of the European Union, then there is a degree of collective defence involved in that. And one of the things I did at NATO, which nobody really knows or understands, was to create the Berlin Plus arrangements. Berlin Plus, as the two ministers here will remember, gives the European Union the right to access NATO capabilities in a situation where the European Union wants to take military action, but NATO is not involved. You can say you're neutral, but actually you're not really neutral in that concept. But you can still be a venue for discussion.
All right.
Or for even hosting me here celebrating the 25th anniversary of Slovenia entering the alliance.
We celebrate the parties as they come. Well, thanks a lot, Lord Robertson. I would like to open the floor for questions. Please introduce yourself, and please no lengthy speeches, but questions, please.
My name is Günther Felling. I'm campaigning for Austria joining NATO, Ukraine joining NATO, Kosovo and Bosnia. That would be the logical thing, but you don't want to enter Austrian internal politics, Lord Robertson. So my question is more about the European Union-NATO relationship, because we had a very big progress here with this basic treaty on the January of 2023. And do you think it's also possible that the EU as an alliance, as a union, as a political union in the future might be having the same status like an ally in NATO? And would that also be possible that membership of the EU in NATO would facilitate the return of the United Kingdom into the European Union at a later stage?
Well, there's at least 10 questions involved.
10 questions, but really wrapped very swiftly in one.
I know. I remember going to Turkmenistan, and I said to the press conference, I said one issue, one question, and one said, well, I have one question in 5 parts to do with that. No, I was very strongly in favour of European defence and the European Union having a defence component. What I was opposed to was wiring diagrams that didn't connect to capabilities. So the European Union is going to have to, in its own interests, now that we know what the threat is and how brutal that threat can be, is going to have to establish more than just the European Defence Agency. It's going to have to create mechanisms whereby it has got a degree of autonomy. And the Berlin Plus arrangements give it access to, to the supreme headquarters in Mons in a situation where it might need that. But it needs to do much more than that. But it's a separate organism to NATO. It's different to NATO, but they are umbilically tied together, and it makes a lot of sense to do that. In terms of the United Kingdom rejoining the European Union, I think that's probably beyond my lifetime. I think it's a reality. We did it. I regret it. I fought against it, and I think that there is now buyer's regret in the country as a whole, but I don't think it's feasible for any political party in the UK just now to talk about rejoining. Would they want us? Would the terms be the same as they were before? These are issues that are really not on the agenda at the moment.
Please, former Foreign Minister and EU Commissioner Benita Ferrero-Waldner.
Well, Lord Robertson, you didn't mention China at all. Of course, it's not directly affecting NATO, but I think it does affect NATO because it's the big players. It's US, it's China, and again, Russia, of course, coming up. Where do you see the role of China in the future?
Well, China is hugely, hugely important. I did mention it in terms of writing the rules of the world, if Putin gets away with it. But it is quite intriguing at the moment that China is supporting Russia, but not supporting Russia. It's giving political cover to them, but not giving them the military hardware that they would want. To the extent that the Russians have had to go to North Korea in order to get the military equipment they require, and not from China, which is quite puzzling. And this week's Economist newspaper has an article, I don't know whether people have read it, I thoroughly recommended it, one of the by invitation columns by a professor at the University of Beijing, saying that Russia will lose the war in Ukraine. A fascinating piece, because nobody who is a professor at the University of Beijing is going to write without the official permission. And it's also fascinating that Russia has never recognized the annexation of Crimea. They don't believe in breakaway provinces, and therefore they're pretty lukewarm in the support they give to Russia as a whole. But they're waiting in the wings. And if Russia succeeds, then essentially they are the big brother to Russia. They're buying oil at discounted prices. They're convenient, supporting them but not supporting them at the same time. But they will be in the driving seat in the new world order if Putin gets away with invading the next door neighbor. And they're powerful, they're big, they're economically strong, they are involved now in pretty well every country in the world. The British higher education system in the in my country is almost dependent on Chinese students, and that applies right across Europe as a whole. They own a big chunk of American debt. So they are involved in the financial and economic systems of the world, and therefore difficult to discount. And we've got to learn to live with them. But I really worry that if what happens in Ukraine goes against the Ukrainians, then China gets the biggest boost.
Thank you. I would suggest that we take 2 questions now in a row. The gentleman in the back, and then the ambassador of Croatia, please.
Thank you very much. Lawrence Kettle from the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. I focus on EU security and defence and EU-UK relations post-Brexit. Back when you were the Secretary of Defence, you conducted, in the first years of the Labour government, you conducted the Strategic Defence Review, which you then published in '98. And back then it was, you reorganised the army, including the creation of the 16th Air Assault Brigade. There was the coming into force of the Vanguard-class submarines and so on and so forth. How would you compare and contrast when you did the strategic defense review back in the 90s with the current British IR 2023 security and defense policy, and would you argue, is it adequate for the challenges that the UK is facing, more than adequate or less than adequate? Thank you.
Okay, well, the second question, please.
Thank you very much. I'm the Croatian ambassador here in Vienna. Just a little question about the actual situation. 2 hours before, I've got the message that Iran has said that they will not wait anymore for an attack of Israel from Israel. They will use weapons there will be an answer in seconds. Do you think that it could be possible that Iran could use a nuclear, so-called dirty nuclear weapon? And if that would be the case, what that mean for the NATO and for us here in Europe?
Going back to the Strategic Defence Review of 1998, it was a very comprehensive review that we did at that time, and I prophesied at the time that if it was a success, it would be known as the SDR 1998, and if it was a failure, it would be known as the Robertson Review. I'm glad now that my name has disappeared, and it has been a success. But it was of its time. It was of its time. We were talking at that time about going far, hitting hard, staying long. We then sort of had terrorism involved in it. The world has changed, completely now. We're now talking about national resilience. We're talking about territorial defence, and we're talking now about the alliance in confrontation with an actual aggressor at close contact as well. So the current government brought out an integrated review, and then an integrated review refreshed, all of which was highly commendable and good in terms of strategy, but lacked the prioritization that is required. You need to know what your country wants to do. What we did in 1997 was to say, this is the foreign policy of the country. Now, on an absolute base with nothing taken for granted, what do you need in order to conduct that foreign policy for the country? And that's what I think every country should do. And I understand that Austria is going through the process at the moment, and I recommend that is the best way of doing it. If you don't know what it is you want to do and what your country needs to do, you can't then order your defence and the component parts of that. And it's pretty sharp as to what needs to be done at the present moment. And if Labour wins the election, then the Shadow Defence Secretary, with whom I'm having lunch tomorrow, has promised another strategic defence review, and we'll see how that develops. But again, it has to be established on the basis of the priorities of what the foreign policy of the country actually is, and how you then conduct it in terms of military operations. The Croatian ambassador asks a difficult question. Do I think that Iran will go nuclear? No, it won't. It hasn't got the ability to, hasn't yet got the ability to have a proper weaponized nuclear weapon, and I hope that that's in the distant future as well. But you did caveat it by saying a dirty bomb, and anybody can operate a dirty bomb. But nobody does it because it crosses a line, an even brighter red line than the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And I think the Iranians are absolutely determined not to be involved in a war that they would lose. They have enough problems with their own restless population at the present moment. So the idea of upping the ante and bringing the Americans in, as any kind of nuclear exchange would undoubtedly do, is not in their interests at all. I think if one was sitting in Tehran, what you want to do is to get America out of the region as a whole. Their ambition is to dominate the Middle Eastern region as a whole, and they can't do that as long as America is deeply engaged and in supporting Israel. So I hope that Israel will carefully calibrate any response to what happens the other night, and all the friends of Israel are telling them that, and make sure that they don't overdo it. And I hope that Iran accepts the fact that they also have responsibilities in terms of what their own objectives are for the region as a whole.
Well, we got this gentleman, and then...
My name is Colin Munro, former UK ambassador to the OSCE. My question was about British, the adequacy of British, the resources devoted to the UK's defence. But I have a comment about Putin. I was in East Berlin when the wall fell down, and Vladimir Putin was in Dresden, and I followed his career pretty closely ever since. I think it's okay, he may have changed his mind, but I also think he's a KGB-trained liar and inspired by resentment and a desire for vengeance. It doesn't really matter to how we handle him now, but I think it points to the fact that we may have earlier seriously underestimated his capabilities and intentions.
Thank you. Over there, right? You want to ask a question, and then the ambassador of Sudan.
Knut Kirste from the NATO Liaison Office to the international organizations here in Vienna. Lord Robertson, thank you for your analysis and insight. Here's my question. So when Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine ends, we'll all have to think about how to re-establish sustainable security in Europe and sort of build a new security architecture for Europe. And much is unknown about how this will look like, to be honest. So what's your take on this? What order do you see emerging after this war, terrible war in Ukraine? Thank you.
And Mr. Ambassador?
Thank you very much, Lord Robertson, for this very interesting. My question is, do you see any impact of the current war in Gaza over the future of NATO, in the sense that we in the global south now, we are seeing some sort of erosion of the credibility of the West? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So if I turn to Colin Munro, another Scot in the audience. The British ambassador is Scottish, and I'm Scottish, but that's, we're a small component of the international scene. I think you were first of all asking about the money for defence before you went on to Vladimir Putin, but they are connected. We will have to, in our country as well as every other country, spend more money on defence. And indeed on diplomacy as well. Defence, the military is the last line of defending a country, whereas the front line is actually in diplomacy. We're talking in the Diplomatic Academy, so I'm preaching to the choir here as well. But the reduction in diplomatic capability in the West has been devastating, and it is not been mirrored by what the Russians are doing. The Russian Foreign Service is working overtime, and their intelligence agencies and the paramilitaries like the Wagner Group and what has now replaced it are all now instruments of Russian foreign policy that puts us all into the shade. And I think we need to start thinking much more about the protection of future generations. And that's only going to be achieved if we've got proper deterrence against the likelihood of adversaries in the future attacking our way of life. And we've now seen in graphic detail what one country can do. Happens to have nuclear weapons, and that makes it difficult to tangle with. but we've already seen that, and therefore, if we are concerned about our grandkids, as I am, then we've got to make sure that we spend properly on deterring those adversaries in the future. To do with that, in terms of Vladimir Putin, as you say, you watched him at the time. He was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB at the time, in November 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down. That day the Berlin Wall came down, there were 370,000 Soviet troops in East Germany that day. And they were told to stay in barracks, including Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Putin. But because the Politburo realized that there was no way that they were going to stop what had happened in Berlin that day. Just as on the 4th of June 1989, earlier that same year, when Solidarity was elected as the government of Poland, there were 60,000 Soviet troops in Poland that day, and they were told to stay in their barracks. And in 1989, the Soviet Union was involved in Afghanistan, and without any off-ramp, without any face saving, the Politburo decided that they were losing money, they were losing people, they weren't winning, and they pulled out. They pulled out of Afghanistan. So it is quite capable for an authoritarian regime to turn on sixpence and simply declare victory and to move on. And that's why the solidarity of the West is so important, because that's the one thing that will have an influence on the mind of the people inside the Kremlin, that very small group of people around Vladimir Putin, who at the end of the day will make the decision as to whether he goes on with this war into the future with all the damaging consequences for Russia, or simply pull out like they did in November 1989.
New security
architecture. New security architecture. Well, who knows? When it's over, it'll be over, and then we'll have to make a reassessment. I made speeches at the time of the NATO-Russia Council that foresaw some new security architecture in Europe that would have included Russia. The speech that Putin made that day, and the remarks he made at the press conference afterwards indicated that Russia saw common problems that needed common solutions. And there's another thing he said that day, which if I could read to you, is actually quite striking as well, because it illustrates something else about Russia, which I think people need to recognize at the present moment. He said, Russia has always had a crucial role in world affairs. The problem for our country has been, however, that over a very long period of time, a situation arose in which Russia was on one side and the other side was practically the whole of the rest of the world. Nothing good came of that confrontation between us and the rest of the world. Now, that was a bit of sort of self-awareness at the time, which he hasn't displayed since then, but I think it shows that underlying lack of self-confidence that Russia always seems to have at the present moment. But at that stage, it looked as though they might be involved in some common architecture against common threats. But that was lost along the way, and it's not easy to see whether it's going to be replicated. I don't hold the view that any successor to Putin would be worse. That's a common thought that is going around at the present moment. Maybe we're better with Putin than with somebody worse. Well, actually, we couldn't get anybody worse. He's on the very edge of extreme activity. He's called up huge numbers of young Russians to be sent into the mince machine of the Donbass. He's turned the economy into a war economy. 30% of this year's budget is going to be devoted to defense. He's spending 6.5% of GNP on defense, much more than the United States of America. So, you know, I can't imagine how a successor could actually do much worse than that, short of using a nuclear weapon, which I think is beyond possibility. But there is a future for Russia and for Russians. I was the deputy chairman of BP's joint venture in Russia, and I got to know a lot of the people involved in that company, decent, honorable, you know, liberal thinking people. I was going to see the deputy prime minister in Moscow 2 or 3 years back, and I went to the internal audit department of TNK-BP, which was a huge, huge department. And I said, have you got any message for the deputy prime minister? And they said, yes. And I said, well, what is it? They said, this country can't thrive because of corruption, bureaucracy, and stupidity. And I said, well, what do you mean by stupidity? And they said, why do we need our own satellite tracking device, the Globus system? But these were the things. So I said, well, I tell them that tomorrow at the White House. And they said, yes. And I said, well, I tell them who told me. And they said, yes. They wanted that message to get through. So these are people, you know, ordinary people in Russia who are not, you know, part of the Putin mold. And we've got to reach out to them as well. And what's the third question?
The impact of the Gaza war to the credibility of the West and the NATO. And if the hosts allow, we would have 2 more questions, if that's okay. Okay. Good, please.
Well, the ambassador of Sudan asked a very relevant question. And I think, unfortunately, you know, there is a degree of double standards in the way in which we're treating this matter. We support the right of Israel, surrounded as it is by enemies in the region, to defend itself. We defend the right to take action against those who were responsible for the 7th of October, and their right to try and eliminate Hamas in the tunnels and bunkers underneath the Gaza Strip. But I think that has been characterized by a Russian propaganda machine now as being the double standards that we criticize Russia for attacking its neighboring state, while at the same time defending what is going on in there as well. But I think it's a false comparison to make. Israel is dealing with a terrorist organization in the Gaza Strip. Ukraine is being attacked without any provocation at all. There was no provocation from Ukraine against the Russian Federation at all. They were attacked illegally and unprovoked, and therefore the comparison is completely wrong. But where I think the Global South don't recognize the implications of what is going on in Ukraine is the fact that if a big country with nuclear weapons can change borders by the use of force, then what border in the world is going to be immune? You know, your country has already gone through, you know, the stresses and strains of living within the old colonial boundaries in Africa. And the rest of Africa is largely living with the old colonial borders, which by and large people have said we'll keep, because otherwise if you upset one border, you upset every border. And I think the borders in Africa, as well as the borders on the Asian continent or even in Latin America, are under threat if the principle is established that a big nuclear weapon state can change borders by the use of force without any provocation at all. That leads to international anarchy, and that doesn't help anybody.
Mm-hmm. Well, 2 or 3 very short questions and answers, then we really have to close the session. The lady in the last row, please.
My name is Miriam Reich, and I study art history and aspire to study peace and conflict studies in Innsbruck. and my question is about the stability of NATO. You said before the situation is very stable, but when there's doubt coming up, for example in the USA with Trump doubting who to help and who not to help, and we see similar thoughts in far-right parties, is there a real possibility of destabilizing NATO within NATO like this?
All right. There was one gentleman over there, please, and then Walter Fechting.
Colonel Sulzer, Defense Attaché of Switzerland. Switzerland is preparing to host a conference on Ukraine mid of June in Switzerland. Russia is not planning to participate, so observers know that this conference only will be a stepping stone in the future. But nevertheless, if you look at Putin's declarations and Peskov's declarations, there are signs that the Kremlin is quite nervous about being more isolated. In your view, what is the best outcome of such a first conference to be hoped for? Thank you.
Walter Feicht, yes, the last one, please.
The very last one. Walter Feichtinger, Center for Strategic Analysis, previously National Defense Academy. China was already mentioned as a geopolitical actor, and NATO has mentioned also the Indo-Pacific as a very important region, the most important, I would say, in geopolitical competition. What role do you see for NATO in this region? Thank you.
The first question that was asked by the lady at the back is a really important one, and that is about the internal strength and unity within NATO. And it's not simply a question about whether Donald Trump becomes the president. There are other mavericks, there are other NATO skeptics inside the NATO tent. We have to live with that. You know, the great weakness of NATO is the fact that it is made up of 32 democracies, but it is also the towering strength of NATO that it is made up of 32 democracies. Now that means 32 governments, 32 sets of ministers, 32 public opinions. And that means, you know, that from time to time you have a hell of a job gathering it together and getting a degree of unanimity about it. But that is what, over the years, the regularity of the meetings in NATO has produced. And once consensus has been established, consensus can only be broken by consensus. So it's a very difficult process, and I lived through that for 4 years, trying to get agreement, you know, from some very fractious people who believed that their country's viewpoint was more important than any other country's viewpoint. And some of these were quite small countries, and yet, you know, sometimes the tail did wag the dog, but we had to work carefully, painfully, patiently in order to get consensus. And that's what we're going to have to do in the future. Because at the end of the day, all of the countries in the alliance, you know, whether they are passionate believers in collective defense or grudging acceptors of the principle, you know, some of them forced on them by previous decisions by electorates, they all know that they've got a degree of protection that they wouldn't otherwise have. 1 billion people sleep easily in their beds at night because NATO and Article 5 are protecting them. And that matters more than the individual views of individual countries. So at the end of the day, the NATO skeptics, whether they include people like Donald Trump or Prime Minister Orban or Prime Minister Fico in Slovakia, at the end of the day, they know that the safety of their people depends upon being in the alliance, and the alliance being a strong thing as well. The Swiss conference on Ukraine, I hope, is going to be a positive one, and will rally support for the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian people. As I say, the attack on them was unprovoked. It was pure aggression nothing more than that. And that solidarity and unity is going to be hugely important in persuading Putin to do what the Politburo did in 1989 and to come out of Ukraine and face defeat there as well. I also hope that it will also look at the reconstruction of Ukraine and how that's going to be financed. There's a big debate ongoing at the present moment as to whether or not the money that was locked up, Russian money locked up in the West, should now be used for the reconstruction of Ukraine. That'll undoubtedly be a subject matter for conversation in Switzerland, and I hope that the signals that come from Switzerland are listened carefully in the Kremlin as a whole. The Indo-Pacific you raise is hugely important. The Euro-Atlantic area is expanded all the time in terms of definition. Even when I was there, we had the Mediterranean dialogue, right from Israel right round to Mauritania, and after 9/11, it stopped being about Israel and started to be about common interests and common views about terrorism at that stage. Subsequently, NATO has been involved in the Gulf with a dialogue with the Gulf states. And the last NATO summit, and I guess the next NATO summit will have to look at what we do about China and the threat by China in the Euro-Atlantic area as a whole. But the countries in the Indo-Pacific are themselves now beginning to assemble in a sort of quasi-NATO-like form. And maybe as an example, NATO provides for them of collective defense. Some of them are beginning to realize, countries like Japan and Indonesia, Australia, are beginning to recognize that if they don't have a degree of collective defense, then China is going to be running things in a way that would not be satisfactory to them.
Well, thanks a lot, Lord Robertson. I think I did not promise too much. These were really the most interesting and entertaining and sometimes controversial 90 minutes. Thanks for the host for organizing it.
Thank you.
And I wish you all a nice day. And I think you've got enough food for thought, not even for this day, but for the whole world. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you.